Can religion and politics mix? Hello. Today it's July 2, 2020, and I'm here in an attempt to dissect and discuss an important issue entitled Can Religion and Politics Mix? Well, that is a very tricky question, in fact. But the truth is, the answer depends really on who answers the question. And if we are going to ask a liberal or a Democrat, we might probably get a no for an answer. On the other hand, if we are going to ask a Muslim cleric, the answer would probably be yes. And still, if we ask a conservative Christian, they or he or she may vacillate between answering a yes and a no. It still depends upon how conservative or how liberal that Christian is. Now, since we may get valid answers depending on the background of the person trying to answer the question, and since we live in a free world, we then allow different people to have different responses to the question. And of course, we are not going to push on our belief on anyone out of respect for them. Now, since both politics and religion are two indispensable institutions in any given society, and that it affects people's lives, we then therefore are compelled to have our own stand or position on the question at hand, which is the question, can religion and politics mix? In a conservative Islamic country where a de facto theocracy exists and where the Sharia law governs their justice system, religion does play a big factor in politics, and they are fine with it, no matter what people of other religions, political systems, or nationality would say in favor or against them. What's even noteworthy is that the superimposition of religious tenets in their politics and government have resulted, in fact, in the stability of their society for some period of time in their history, and even reaching to the present in some Islamic or Muslim countries. But then again, except only for those Islamic societies being faced with insurgency or armed conflict. And so we can say, because of these, we can say that religion superimposing itself upon their social structure and social system is somehow beneficial to them, regardless of what others say. Now, this type of social system is, however, intolerable to liberal societies who live by the principle of the separation of the church and state, or what we call secularization. In the first place, liberal societies such as those in Europe and in the Western world as a whole had lived through the age of uh, religious intolerance, or that age characterized by religious wars in their history. We can remember the age where Christians fought against Muslims in the series of crusades during the Middle Ages. If their aversion to religious imposition is caused by that part of history, then we can say that they have learned their part and it is somehow acceptable. However, if there are wrong policies imposed by the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, which is at the top of their society at that time, which in truth wreak havoc in their Christian societies, no matter how Christian they were at that time, more particularly during the so called Middle Ages, then we can say that those policies could only be wrong because of the wrong or evil intent of those imposing them, or the wrong intent of the church leaders, but not necessarily the God that they follow. It doesn't mean that if the religious policies are wrong, then God, suppose they believe in God, is already wrong. For that could be a wrong interpretation of church doctrines by their leaders, trying to interpret and implement supposed divine policies on earth, which such wrong policies and wrong decisions or wrong programs they imposed upon their societies created the havoc that they experienced. In fact, if we are going to base it from the Holy Scriptures, we can see that it is replete with Almighty or with God mocking and criticizing religious leaders for their sinfulness and blatant disregard of His will, trying to execute their own acts and ordinances on their own whim, but making it appear that it is God's will. In short, they were using God's words for their own end. Not necessarily it is because the will of God. Now, there is not just one, two, three, four verses or more, both in the Old and New Testament, that center on the blatant use of God's words by men and leaders, yet for their own set of selfish interests. And these are religious leaders that we know them in history. Yet some would perhaps ask a logical question. That is, does it not make God accountable and at fault for allowing the wicked religious leaders to exercise their whim at the expense of the people, while God Himself, being the omnipotent God, is supposedly over them? Well, that is the logical idea for those who do not understand and hence believe that since God is allowing things to be like they did, then it would also be His fault. And the reason why people continue to sin, that is because God wanted it that way. And then in that way, people live their lives away from His own ordinances. Wouldn't that be God's fault? Well, God cannot be held accountable for His actions. It is not given to man to question why God created the world and man in it. That is beyond the temporal ability of man, who simply lives and then dies, leaving this world behind him. The purpose is reserved by God to Himself. In fact, we can dwell further scrutinizing the divine reason why man is given free will, which to some is the cause of man's sinfulness and hence could be the fault of God. But then again, the divine reason is reserved by the Almighty Father to Himself alone. And there are also not one, two, three, four, but many verses in the Bible that says so. Now, for those who are saying that religion and politics do not mix, that is only acceptable if they limit the idea on religion, but not necessarily concerning God Himself or God the Father Himself. As to why? Well, because God does not dwell alone on religion. In fact, God even despises many religious practitioners, or, sorry, God even despises many religious practices. That is what I meant to say. And of course, God despises many religious practices without mentioning them here out of respect for those people who still do those religious practices. But in truth, several times it is written in the Holy Scriptures that God despises men who use His own words for their own selfish benefits. And the truth is, there are in fact no governments in the world, or civil laws for that matter, that do not, in one way or another, take its cue from the divine principles. What do we mean with this? It is because it is written that not man but rather God who taught man the principles of truth, the principles of fairness, the principles of justice, the principles of mercy, and the principles of punishments. These are principles that govern the way people create their government and the way people enact civil laws. These are the primary principles that guide them, that guide society for that matter. And these are the basis in establishing governments or civil laws. The principles of truth, fairness, justice, mercy, and punishment, as well as the knowledge of the common good, these are principles that humanity did not invent. No matter how we may try to scrutinize and go back in history, somebody taught these principles on men. And they did not simply came out in human minds out of incidents. They are principles that were taught to humanity by God regardless of religion. And these principles are the principles that guide governments and civil laws. So therefore, with these, how can we say that politics and religion cannot mix? Maybe religion, if we are talking about religion per se, or the structure of human beings who try to establish a system wherein they say that it is God, where these laws, where these systems come from. But in truth and in fact, religion is different from the nature of the Almighty Father Himself. And since that is the case, what we can say is, perhaps it is true that politics cannot mix with religion if we are talking about religion per se, because religion are mere uh, tenets, mere instructions that are, and organizations that are formed by men, and these things are often away from the real intent of God. So, in that way, we cannot say fully that politics cannot mix with divine laws, or governments cannot mix with divine laws, because divine laws, or the principles that the Almighty taught humanity, such as those that I have mentioned, such as truth, fairness, justice, mercy, punishment, and the concept of common good, They are taught by God upon men, and men did not invent these principles by himself alone. So now, can religion and politics mix? Well, perhaps not religion and politics together, but rather divine laws with politics. And finally, just remember, above all things, glory and honor belongs to the Almighty Father. Amen.